Now let's talk about all the spin and flip variations because it's always hip to flip. To begin, I thought it might be easier to distinguish the two types of flips. The best terms I can think of to describe these flips are rolls and cartwheels. Rolls are when you flip over your toes or your heels to make your board do a barrel roll. Very graceful. A cartwheel would be when you flip over your nose or your tail to make your board do a flip. Also very graceful. In the upcoming section, you'll see a list of tricks correlated to the edges and tips of your board. Keep in mind that sometimes a spinning flip and a spinning roll may have the same trick names because they look so similar. Also, in this portion of the video, I'm going to be talking about kicker hits, but just know that the same names apply if you're hitting a wick behind a boat. And to make this video a lot easier to understand, everything will be going off the right kicker. Just know that everything still applies if you're going off the left kicker and or wick. Alright, so we'll do this in clockwise order for every trick, starting from the top. Whenever you cartwheel over your nose, it's called a front flip. Whenever you roll over your heel side edge, it's called a tantrum. Whenever you cartwheel over your tail, it's called a back roll. And whenever you roll over your toe side edge, it's called a Mexican back roll or a Mexi roll. If you're on your toe side edge, cartwheeling over your nose is called a front flip. Rolling over your toe side edge is called a front roll. Cartwheeling over your tail is called a wildcat. And rolling over your heel side edge is called a back roll. Now let's go over all the flips if you do a 180 with it. If you're on your heel side edge and you cartwheel over the nose and do a front side 180, it's called a front to fakie. If you do a back side 180, it's called a front flip to blind or a Hasselhoff if it's switch. If you roll over your heel side edge and do a front side 180, it's called a tantrum to fakie. If you roll over your heel side edge and do a back side 180, it's called a tantrum to blind. If you cartwheel over your tail and do a front side 180, it's called a roll to revert. If you do a switch, it's called a half cab roll. And if you do a backside, it's called a roll to blind. And if you roll over your toe side edge, it has the exact same names as the tail. So you have roll to revert, half cab roll if it's switch, and roll to blind. If you're coming in on your toe side edge and you cartwheel over your nose and do a front side 180, it's called a scarecrow. If you do a backside 180, it's called a fruit loop. If you roll over your toes and do a front side 180, it's called a scarecrow. If you do a backside 180, it's called a tootsie roll. If you cartwheel over your tail and do a front side 180, it's called a roll to revert. And if you do a backside 180, it's called a roll to blind. If you roll over your heel side edge and do a front side 180, it's called a roll to revert. And if you do a backside 180, it's called a roll to blind. And now we're going to get into mobs. A mob is any flip with a handle pass 360. When you're on your heel side edge and you cartwheel over your nose and do a front side 360, it's called a slim chance. If it's switch, it's called a fat chance. And if you do a backside 360, it's called a backside front mob. If you roll over your heel side edge and do a front side 360, it's called a $1 billion baby. If you do a backside 360, it's called a Moby Dick. And if you do a backside 360 Olay, it's called a whirlybird. If you cartwheel over your tail and do a front side 360, it's called a back mob. And if you do a 360 backside, it's called a KGB. And the same applies over your toe side edge. When you spin front side, it's called a back mob, and when you spin backside, it's called a KGB. When you're on your toe side edge and you cartwheel over your nose and do a front side 360, it's called a crow mob. If you do a backside 360, it's called a flavor flip. If you roll over your toes and do a front side 360, it's also called a crow mob. If you do it switch, it's called a skeezer. And if you do a backside, it's called a dum-dum. If you cartwheel over your tail and do a front side 360, it's called a Pete Rose. And if you do a backside, it's called a blind Pete. And just like flips over your tail, your heel side edge will have the exact same tricks. So a front side 360 will be a Pete Rose. A switch front side 360 is called an X mob. And a backside 360 is called a blind Pete. And when you do a blind Pete in the cup position, it's called a Slurpee. Now that you've learned all the names of the mobs, all the names start to become easier to understand. And if you add a 180 to any mobe, it'll be the name of that mobe 540. Since all mobes have a 360 in them, the extra 180 turns it into a mobe 540. Then mobe 720, then mobe 900, etc. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below and I will answer them as quickly as possible. And if this is your first time on my channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more water sports related content. As always, I want to thank you guys for watching and I will catch you guys in the next video.